In the divorce, the husband became a millionaire and left his ex-wife with just an old little house in the countryside. Days later, while cleaning the hidden basement, what she found left her in shock. Life, for Elizabeth Harper, had always been a symphony composed in tandem with Richard, the man with whom she'd shared the last 20 years of her existence. At 40, she saw herself as the embodiment of stability, a safe harbor built with the mortar of love, dedication, and daily sacrifices. Together, they had erected an empire that wasn't just measured in bank balances, but in the bricks of the comfortable home where they raised their son, Michael, now a young man of 22, and in the dreams of a peaceful retirement, cradled by memories of a lifetime of companionship. She had forsaken her own career, her own ambitions, to be the foundation upon which Richard could build his success as a businessman. Each sacrifice was a note in that love song. Each sleepless night tending to a feverish child, each meticulously prepared dinner after an exhausting day, all seemed a fair contribution to the family harmony. Little did she know that behind the scenes, Richard was rewriting the entire score, turning the shared melody into a selfish and cruel solo where only his voice would echo in the end. The divorce wasn't a period, it was a demolition. The news hit like thunder in a clear sky, unexpected and devastating. Richard, with the coldness of a surgeon amputating a gangrenous limb, announced that the marriage was over, but the true extent of the betrayal only revealed itself in the cold, impersonal law office. There, seated in a leather chair that seemed to swallow her, Elizabeth listened to Richard's lawyer, a man with a cynical smile and eyes devoid of compassion, detail the division of assets, or rather, the lack thereof. Document after document, it became clear that the wealth she had helped build had evaporated. The properties, investments, hefty accounts, all had been methodically transferred, dissolved into a complex web of simulated sales to shell companies and partners she'd never heard of. Strawmen, the lawyer explained in a professorial tone, as if teaching a naive child about the world's cruelties. Richard, the man who had vowed to love her in sickness and in health, in riches and in poverty, had orchestrated a meticulous fraud to ensure the wealth stayed solely with him. He had become a solitary millionaire, and she, the silent architect of that empire, was being discarded with the crumbs. And what bitter crumbs they were. For Elizabeth, the woman who had been his companion for 2 decades, Richard generously left a small old house in Charleston. Her forgotten property, bought early in their marriage as a romantic whim, a future retreat that never materialized. The house, nestled on one of the historic streets of the city, was a dusty memory of a time when dreams were still shared. Now, it was the ultimate symbol of her humiliation, a forced exile. While the lawyer spoke, Elizabeth's world crumbled in silence. The air felt thin, the words buzzed in her ears like an angry swarm of bees. She looked at Richard, seeking a glimpse of the man she had married, but found only a stranger with icy eyes, his expression a mix of impatience and triumph. He looked at her, not as the mother of his child, but as an obstacle finally overcome, a dead weight he was shedding to soar higher. Michael, their son, sat beside her, his face a mask of disbelief and contained fury. With the moral uprightness that youth still allows, he stood up, his voice trembling with indignation. "Dad, how can you do this? How can you treat Mum like she's trash? She dedicated her life to you, to us. This isn't fair, it's monstrous." Michael's voice echoed in the silent room, a cry for decency in an ocean of sordidness. Richard, however, remained impassive. He turned to his son with an irritated paternalism, as if scolding a child for an untimely tantrum. "Michael, you're young. You don't understand business. Your mother will be taken care of. She has a roof over her head. Life is tough, and I'm just securing the future. My future." The response was an even deeper blow, confirmation that, for Richard, family wasn't a sanctuary, but a business from which he was divesting the unproductive minority partner. Elizabeth's humiliation was now complete, public, witnessed by her own son, who saw his father transform into a monster before his eyes. Leaving that office was like emerging from a nightmare, only to find reality even more terrifying. The sun outside seemed to mock her pain, illuminating a world that was no longer hers. The house where she had lived, the car she drove, the accounts she used for groceries, all stripped away. She was a foreigner in her own life. The following days were a blur of cardboard boxes and silent tears. Each item she packed was a ghost of lost happiness. Photos of Michael learning to walk, the first dish set they bought together, the books she read to put him to sleep. Richard watched her with the distance of a foreman, ensuring she took only the strictly personal, as if fearing she might steal a shred of the wealth he now considered exclusively his. With each glance from him, she felt her dignity flayed layer by layer until only the raw flesh of pain and impotence remained. She was no longer the wife, the partner, the matriarch. She was a tenant being evicted, a disposable piece from a past he was eager to erase. And amid all this ruin, one question haunted her, one that would keep her awake for many nights. How could love turn into such calculated cruelty? How could the man who held her hand and promised the world with the same hand push her into such a deep and dark abyss? The answer, she feared, was as devastating as the betrayal itself. Perhaps the love had never truly existed. Perhaps she had been just a useful piece in a game he always played alone. And now the game was over, and she was the sole loser. The road to Charleston was a winding snake of asphalt, twisting through the low country of South Carolina, and for Elizabeth, each curve was a farewell. The car, an old model borrowed from a sympathetic friend, was crammed with the wreckage of her former life. Cardboard boxes containing clothes, a few photos she'd managed to salvage from Richard's vanity bonfire, and her fractured dignity that she was still trying to hold together. Behind her lay the city where she had bloomed and withered, the ghost of a home no longer hers, and the memory of a man turned stranger. Ahead, the historic city awaited, not as a romantic refuge, but as a sentence. The house, that symbol of her demotion, began to shift in meaning. No longer her prison, but her battlefield. If this was where she had to live, then she would make that place a home. A home built not with Richard's money, but with the strength of her own hands. The decision was made on a chilly morning, as she stared at the moldy walls and dust-covered floor. She wouldn't just survive there, she would thrive. She would start with the basics, a deep clean, a scrubbing not just of the physical dirt, but of the emotional grime suffocating her. She needed order, light, a space she could call her own, and it was with that resolve, armed with a broom, buckets, and an iron will, that she began the monumental task of reclaiming her space. Little did she know that, as she swept away spiderwebs and decades of dust, she was about to unearth a secret, far older and more powerful, one that lay dormant beneath the floorboards of her own misfortune, patiently waiting for the right person to awaken it. The true story of that house and her own was just beginning. The drive to Charleston was a serpentine path of asphalt coiling through South Carolina's low country. And for Elizabeth, every bend was a goodbye. The borrowed old car from a pitying friend was stuffed with the remnants of her old life. Cardboard boxes of clothes, some photos she'd rescued from Richard's ego-driven purge, and her shattered dignity she was desperately piecing back together. Left behind was the city of her rise and fall, the spectre of a home no longer hers, and the recollection of a man now alien. Ahead lay the historic city, not a dreamy haven, but a verdict. The little house, once a whisper of promise, now screamed her new reality. Abandonment, precariousness, a forced restart from ground zero. Upon arrival, the sight greeting her was more desolate than her worst recollections. The facade, once painted a hopeful blue, was now faded and stained by time, the paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The wooden windows, with cracked panes, resembled blind, sorrowful eyes. Wild vines twisted up the walls, as if nature sought to reclaim the forgotten structure. The air inside was heavy, laden with the scent of dust, mold, and loneliness. No electricity, the faucets coughed dry air before spitting rusty water, and the roof sported holes promising to turn any rain into an indoor waterfall. This wasn't a house. It was a ruin, a mausoleum for the dreams she and Richard once shared. That first night, wrapped in a thin blanket on a donated mattress, Elizabeth felt the cold cut to her bones, a chill from both the damp walls and the void in her soul. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind's howl through cracks and the sound of her own tears falling in the dark. The harshness of the new life imposed itself without ceremony. Elizabeth's days turned into a battle for survival. Her hands, once accustomed to fine fabrics and a computer keyboard, were now rough and calloused, from hauling buckets of water from a public spigot, scrubbing the grimy floor, and trying to patch the house's open wounds with improvised materials. Hunger was a constant companion, a cruel reminder that the stocked fridge and full pantry were luxuries from another universe. She learned to live on the bare minimum, turning a vegetable soup into a feast and finding gratitude in stale bread. Humiliation was her shadow, following her through Charleston's cobblestone streets, where neighbors' curious gazes seemed to pierce her skin. She was the poor thing, the woman abandoned by her rich husband, a spectacle of misfortune to be whispered about at windows and corner stores. Each pitying look was a fresh stab at her already battered pride. Amid this desert of solitude, Michael's presence was the only oasis. The son, newly married and himself struggling with the financial woes of a young couple, refused to abandon her. Twice a week, he made the long drive to Charleston, his modest car's trunk loaded not with luxuries, but essentials, bags of rice, beans, vegetables, and most importantly, the warmth of his embrace. He arrived with a smile, trying to mask the pain of seeing his mother in such a state. While she cooked what he brought on a gas-hot plate, he busied himself fixing what he could. A loose shingle, a window that wouldn't close, a pipe that insisted on leaking. They were small gestures, drops of care in an ocean of need, but to Elizabeth, they were worth more than all the gold Richard had hoarded. "Mom, this is temporary," he said, holding her hands, his voice firm with a conviction he might not even feel. "We'll figure it out. Dad will come to his senses, or justice will be done." "You won't stay like this." She just nodded, not wanting to shatter her son's youthful hope with the weight of her own skepticism. In their talks, Michael brought news from the world she'd left behind, news that were like salt rubbed into open wounds. While Elizabeth counted pennies for candles, Richard orchestrated a spectacle of opulence on social media. His profile, once discreet and familial, had transformed into a billboard for his new millionaire bachelor life. The photos were a parade of wealth clichés, him with a forced tanned smile, next to sports cars worth more than her little house, him on luxury yachts, champagne flute in hand, surrounded by young women whose smiles were as calculated as the investments drawing them in. The captions were anthems to freedom and success: "Living the life I deserve, hard work pays off, leaving behind what no longer serves me." Each post was a deliberate dagger, a clear message that she, his partner of 20 years, was the dead weight he proudly discarded. Michael showed her the photos, not out of cruelty, but from an indignation he needed to share. "Look at this, Mum. Look at the shamelessness. He doesn't even wait for the divorce to finalize before rubbing this clown show in our faces. And these women, they look my age. It's disgusting." Elizabeth gazed at the images with a strange numbness. The pain was so deep it almost became abstract. The man on the screen with his empty smile and manufactured happiness wasn't the Richard she knew. He was a character, a grotesque avatar of greed and midlife crisis. She saw the fragility behind the ostentation, the desperation of a man trying to fill an inner void with material goods and young bodies. He wasn't building a new life. He was torching the old one and dancing on the ashes, unaware that he himself was being consumed by the fire. Loneliness, however, was a stern teacher. In the long nights when physical exhaustion wasn't enough to quiet the mind, Elizabeth was forced to confront her demons. The anger, the sadness, the overwhelming sense of injustice. She replayed the 20 years of marriage, searching for signs, clues to the betrayal she hadn't seen. Had it always been like this? Had she been so blind? Gradually, amid the pain, a new seed began to sprout. A seed of anger, yes, but a productive anger. A fierce determination not to let that humiliation define her. She wouldn't be the poor thing forever. She wouldn't allow Richard the satisfaction of seeing her destroyed. The little house, that symbol of her downgrade, began to change meaning. No longer her prison, but her battlefield. If this was where she had to live, then she would make that place a home. A home built not with Richard's money, but with the strength of her own hands. The decision was made on a chilly morning, staring at the moldy walls and dust-covered floor. She wouldn't just survive there, she would flourish. Starting with the basics, a deep clean, a purge not only of physical dirt, but of the emotional filth choking her. She needed order, light, a space to call her own. And with that resolution, armed with a broom, buckets, and iron will, she began the monumental task of reclaiming her space. Little did she know that, in sweeping away cobwebs and decades of dust, she was about to unearth a secret much older and more powerful, one slumbering beneath the floorboards of her own despair, waiting patiently for the right person to rouse it. The true story of that house and her own was just beginning. The decision to transform the ruin into a home was the catalyst. Elizabeth, driven by a strength she herself didn't know she possessed, declared war on the decay. Each bucket of dirty water she threw out was like expelling a bit of bitterness. Each cobweb she dismantled was a thread severed from her past inertia. The cleaning was a ritual, a purification. She started with the main rooms, the small living room, the single bedroom, the tiny kitchen. With Michael's help on weekends, the walls were sanded and whitewashed to a luminous white that seemed to expand the space and bring light to the shadows. The broken windows were replaced with new glass, now framing Charleston's Baroque landscape like living paintings. Gradually, the place ceased to be a spectre and gained substance, began to breathe. It was then, turning to the last and most neglected corner of the house, a small storage room in the back that served as a pantry, that fate decided to intervene. The wooden floor in that room was uneven, with dark, worn boards creaking under her feet. One in particular seemed loose. Driven by an impulse, a curiosity that overcame fatigue, she knelt and pried at the board with her fingertips. The wood gave way with a groan, revealing not the dirt floor she expected, but a dark void and an iron ring blackened with age attached to what appeared to be a trapdoor. Elizabeth's heart raced, a mix of fear and excitement coursing through her veins. There, hidden under generations of dust, was something not meant to be found. With trembling hands, she pulled the ring. The heavy wooden hatch was weighty, requiring all her body weight to lift it. A gust of cold, damp air rose from the hole, carrying the smell of wet earth and encapsulated time. It was a basement not on any plans, a secret swallowed by the house. The darkness below was total, intimidating. For a moment she hesitated. What could be down there besides rats, spiders, and oblivion? But the same determination that made her fight the ruin propelled her forward. She fetched a cheap battery-powered flashlight Michael had brought her and shone the beam into the abyss. A rough stone staircase descended into the earth's bowels. Taking a deep breath, like a diver about to plunge into unknown waters, Elizabeth began to descend. Each step took her further from her miserable life and closer to a mystery awaiting her. The basement was larger than she imagined, with rough stone walls weeping moisture. The air was icy and the silence profound, broken only by her own footsteps and her erratic heartbeat. The flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing empty shelves, some rusted farming tools, and the ghostly outlines of objects covered in dusty sheets. It was in a corner, almost camouflaged by the gloom that she saw it. Not a pirate's treasure chest, but something more sober yet imposing. A dark wooden trunk, reinforced with oxidized metal strips, the size of a large suitcase. It was covered in a layer of dust so thick it resembled a shroud. She approached with reverence. No padlock, just a heavy, ornate metal latch. With an effort that made her muscles protest, she lifted it. The trunk's lid opened with a long, ghostly creak that echoed through the basement like a sigh released after a century of confinement. What lay inside made Elizabeth hold her breath. On a crimson velvet lining, now faded and frayed, rested a treasure straight from a fairy tale. Jewels. Dozens of them. Gold necklaces with stones that gleamed even in the flashlight's weak light, brooches encrusted with diamonds and emeralds, rings with rubies the size of fingernails, pearl earrings like goddess tears. They were pieces of exquisite beauty she had never seen, in an antique style clearly from the 19th century. The craftsmanship was masterful, every detail, every filigree, a work of art. They were a queen's jewels, hidden in a commoner's basement. In a contained frenzy, she began touching the pieces. the cold metal against her warm skin. The weight of the gold, the brilliance of the gems, all seemed unreal. They must be replicas, high-quality costume jewelry, but the heft, the perfection, the unmistakable sparkle, everything screamed authenticity. And then, amid the dazzling gleam, she spotted a small secret compartment on the trunk's side. Opening it, she found a bundle of yellowed papers tied with a faded silk ribbon. It was a letter. The handwriting was elegant, flowing, but with a contained urgency in every stroke. With hands even more unsteady, Elizabeth began to read. The letter, dated 1888, was the testament of a trapped soul. "To whomever finds this my refuge," the missive began. "My name is Victoria Kensington, and if these words have reached you, it is because my escape plan failed, or because death found me before freedom." The woman in the letter described a life of opulence and despair. Married to one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Charleston, a cotton baron, she lived in a gilded cage. He didn't abuse her physically, but suffocated her with his pathological jealousy, absolute control, psychological cruelty. He isolated her from friends and family, monitored her every move, ridiculed her thoughts and dreams, turning her into a mere decorative object in his mansion. "He gave me all these jewels," Victoria wrote, "not as gifts of love, but as shackles. Each precious stone is a reminder of my captivity. For years I collected every piece I could, pretending to lose them only to hide them here, in this basement of the only property I own in my name, a small dowry from my late mother. This treasure is not my vanity, it is my passport. With it I intend to buy my passage to Europe, far from his eyes, to a place where I can finally breathe. If I fail, if he discovers me, I fear for my fate. He has already sworn he would rather see me dead than free." The letter ended with a declaration that made Elizabeth's heart stop. "Therefore, to you who have found my secret, I bequeath this treasure. Do not let it fall into wrong hands. Use it to buy your own freedom, whatever it may be. May these jewels, which for me were the symbol of my prison, become for you the keys that will open all doors. Consider yourself my heir of right and soul. May God keep you." Elizabeth sat on the cold basement floor for an immeasurable time, Victoria's letter in one hand, a diamond necklace in the other. The story of that woman, separated from her by over a century, echoed in her own soul in a frightening way. The gilded cage, the controlling husband, the psychological erasure. They were versions of her own story, just in different eras and contexts. Victoria Kensington wasn't a stranger. She was a sister in misfortune. And now, in a ghostly and unbelievable way, she extended a hand across time, offering her not just a fortune but a chance to rewrite her destiny. The value of those jewels was incalculable, but Elizabeth knew instinctively it was in the millions. Millions that could change everything. The humiliation, the poverty, the dependence, all could be swept away forever. But with the discovery came fear. A secret of that magnitude was dangerous. What had happened to Victoria? Had she escaped? Or had the Baron discovered her plan and fulfilled his sinister threat? That woman's history was unfinished, and Elizabeth now was the guardian of her final act. She climbed the basement stairs as if emerging from a trance, closed the trapdoor and replaced the board. The house now held not just her pain, but her hope. A brilliant, dangerous, and utterly transformative hope. The humiliated woman who descended into the basement wasn't the same one who ascended. The one who ascended was heir to a fortune and a promise. And she wouldn't fail where Victoria perhaps had. She would use those keys. She would open all the doors. The discovery of the treasure didn't bring an explosion of joy, but an icy, strategic calm. Elizabeth understood with a clarity bordering on the supernatural that this wasn't a winning lottery ticket, but a complex chess game against fate, and every move needed to be calculated with a master's precision. The initial euphoria gave way to a state of constant alertness. The trunk, with its millionaire contents, was both her salvation and her greatest vulnerability. Richard had left her with nothing, but the universe, in one of its ironic twists, had given her everything. Now the question wasn't whether she could rebuild her life, but how to do it without the weight of that secret crushing her. The first night after the discovery was one of feverish vigilance. With the trunk now hidden in the safest spot she could improvise, under her own mattress, a fortress of poverty no one would suspect, she couldn't sleep a wink. Victoria Kensington's story haunted her. Who was that woman? What had become of her? Curiosity, once a luxury she couldn't afford, became a necessity, a matter of honor. She felt she owed Victoria not just prudent use of the fortune, but also the recovery of her memory, the closure of her silenced story. Driven by this new mission, Elizabeth began her investigation. Charleston, with its cobblestone streets and centuries-old mansions, wasn't just a city. It was an open-air archive, a labyrinth of whispered and forgotten tales. She started her search at the public library, a sanctuary of silence and yellowed paper. Using the excuse of researching her own house's history for a small renovation, she dove into the city's archives, late 19th century newspapers, records of notable families. The name Victoria Kensington soon emerged, but always linked to her husband's, Baron Edmund Harrington, a man whose influence seemed to span every page of local history. He was a cotton titan, a city benefactor, a powerful politician. His public image was impeccable. Victoria, on the other hand, was an ethereal figure, mentioned in society columns for her beauty, her elegance at soirees, but rarely for her own words or deeds. She was an accessory, a lovely adornment on the arm of the mighty Baron. The turning point in the investigation came when Elizabeth found a series of articles from a small local newspaper of the era, a more sensationalist tabloid that dared challenge the official narrative. In September 1888, a brief note announced the sudden and mysterious disappearance of the Baroness Harrington. The official version, spread by larger papers and the Baron's friends, was that Victoria, suffering from nervous melancholy, had retreated to a convent in Europe for spiritual treatment. A convenient and unquestionable story, but the small paper planted seeds of doubt. The editor questioned why no one had seen her leave, why her closest maids had been fired and sent away, why the Baron, instead of showing grief or concern, had plunged into a series of even more audacious parties and deals. One particularly chilling article cited an anonymous source, a supposed mansion servant, who claimed to have heard a violent argument on the night of the disappearance, followed by a deadly silence. The case, however, was never investigated. The Baron's power was an insurmountable wall for justice. He lived a long and prosperous life, dying decades later as one of the region's most respected patriarchs. Victoria Kensington, the woman who dreamed of freedom, simply became a ghost, a forgotten footnote in her husband's biography. Elizabeth felt a shiver. The letter in the basement was the missing piece in that macabre puzzle. Victoria hadn't escaped. Most likely the Baron had discovered her plan and silenced her forever. That treasure wasn't just an inheritance, it was evidence of a crime, the last will of a victim. With Victoria's story fueling her, the next phase of Elizabeth's plan was pragmatic: confirm the treasure's value and turn it into real power. Acting ostentatiously would be suicide. She needed absolute discretion. Using the excuse of visiting a distant cousin, she traveled to Atlanta, taking only 3 smaller but still impressive pieces: an emerald brooch, a ruby ring, and a pair of diamond earrings. She chose a renowned appraiser, an elderly gentleman with a reputation for integrity and confidentiality, located in a discreet commercial building on Peachtree Street. The tension in the appraisal room was palpable. As the man examined the pieces with his loupe, Elizabeth's heart pounded in her throat. "Madam," he said finally, looking up over his glasses, "these are extraordinary pieces. 18-karat gold, handmade work from the late Empire era. The gems are of exceptional quality. Where, if I may ask, did such a family heirloom come from?" Elizabeth recited the rehearsed story, a legacy from a reclusive great-aunt found in an old trunk. The appraiser nodded, respecting her privacy. "Just these 3 pieces," he continued, jotting notes on a pad, "have a conservative market value around $800,000. Elizabeth felt the ground slip away. $800,000. For 3 pieces. The entire trunk. The value was astronomical, certainly exceeding the $10 million she had estimated in her wildest dreams. The return to Charleston was that of a new woman. The value confirmation changed everything. She was no longer a victim waiting for justice. She was a strategist with near unlimited resources. The first step was selling just the emerald brooch, a discreet transaction that netted her over $200,000 in cash. With that initial capital, she opened an account with a digital bank, far from the prying eyes of her hometown branch manager. She also hired in Atlanta a lawyer specializing in estate planning and an investment consultant. To them, she was just a widow who had received a substantial life insurance payout and wanted to manage her resources wisely. No one needed to know the treasure's rocambolesque origin. As the money began working for her in safe, diversified investment funds, Elizabeth maintained her facade of poverty in Charleston. She continued living in the little house, wearing simple clothes, receiving Michael's visits with the same gratitude as before. To the world, she was still the poor thing. But secretly, her life transformed. She installed a discreet security system in the house, bought a small laptop to manage her finances online, and began studying. She read about investments, real estate law, art history. Each book she devoured, each article she read, was a weapon added to her arsenal. She didn't want to just be rich, she wanted to be wise, unshakable. Meanwhile, Richard's life, the modern baron, followed the opposite trajectory. The social media ostentation that once wounded her was now a spectacle she observed with the clinical detachment of a researcher. She saw the signs of the downfall he himself didn't perceive. The increasingly extravagant trips, cars traded every 3 months, opportunity deals with shady partners. Richard was like a drowning man mistaking splashing for swimming. He was burning through the fortune he'd stolen with the fury of one fearing tomorrow. Michael, in his visits, brought reports of the slow-motion implosion. Dad's out of control. He sold the beach condo to invest in a crypto startup a club buddy recommended. He's throwing parties that last days. I think he's lost touch with money. Elizabeth listened, nodded, and offered her son a hot meal. She felt no joy in Richard's impending ruin, but a kind of poetic justice, cold and inevitable. He was just following the script written by all the arrogant fools before him. She, on the other hand, followed Victoria Kensington's script, but with a crucial difference. She was determined to write a different ending. An ending where the woman doesn't vanish, but rises. An ending where freedom isn't a dream, but a reality, built with patience, intelligence, and the silent power of a well-kept secret. The turnaround was complete. The hunted, without the hunter knowing, had become the hunter, and she was just waiting for the right moment to checkmate. Time for Elizabeth became an ally, a patient craftsman weaving her new reality thread by thread, away from the world's eyes. While she, in the quiet of her little house in Charleston, turned Victoria's treasure into a financial and intellectual fortress, Richard's universe disintegrated in a noisy and pathetic display. The fall wasn't a single event, a bolt from the blue, but a slow, progressive erosion, like a cliff devoured by the relentless sea of his own decisions. The fortune he'd stolen, which seemed infinite, proved finite against the magnitude of his arrogance and insatiable hunger for validation. The first tremors were subtle. International trips gave way to weekends at pricey resorts on the Carolina coast. The imported sports car was traded for a luxury domestic model, still showy but a step down the ladder of opulence. The young, stunning women with their keen radars for prosperity began to drift away, replaced by others less demanding but equally fleeting. Richard, blinded by his ego, didn't see this as decline, but as a strategic adjustment. He told his dwindling friends he was diversifying, exploring new markets, but the truth was the foundations of his sand empire were crumbling. The crypto startup, the miraculous investment promising to multiply his capital, turned out to be a fraudulent scheme, swallowing nearly $1 million in a blink. The trendy restaurant he became a partner in, more for a reserved table than business acumen, went bankrupt in under a year, leaving a trail of labor debts. The parties, once epic events that stopped the city, became melancholic gatherings with more waiters than guests, where Richard, voice slurred by alcohol, recounted tales of a success that now sounded like a distant echo. He had become a caricature of himself, the nouveau riche turned nouveau pauvre, an Icarus who flew too close to the sun with stolen wax wings. Michael, the son, was the reluctant chronicler of this tragedy. In his visits to Charleston, his demeanor grew increasingly somber. "Mom, it's worse than I thought," he confessed one afternoon. While helping sand an old dresser Elizabeth had decided to restore. "Dad's selling the home furniture. Bailiffs showed up last week. He's in debt to everyone, from the bank to the neighborhood loan shark. He called me yesterday drunk asking for money. I said I didn't have any and he called me ungrateful." Each of Michael's words was a nail in the coffin of the image he once had of his father. Elizabeth listened in silence, her heart torn between cold justice and the pain of seeing her son suffering, who loved his father despite everything. The coup de grace came 6 months later. Richard, penniless, evicted from the luxury apartment where he lived, lost everything. The cars, designer clothes, expensive watches, all liquidated to pay a fraction of his debts. Friends vanished, lovers evaporated. He was alone, broke and humiliated, a deposed king wandering the kingdom he'd destroyed himself. And in that state of absolute despair, he remembered the one person who had always been there, the one he'd discarded like a useless object. One night, the sound of an old sputtering car stopped in front of Elizabeth's little house. She knew, before even looking out the window, who it was. The figure emerging from the vehicle was a shadow of the man she knew. Thin, shoulders hunched, wearing rumpled cheap clothes, Richard looked like he'd aged 10 years in one. He walked to the door with a beggar's hesitation, the same man who, months before, had expelled her from her own life with an emperor's arrogance. Elizabeth opened the door. She felt no hate, no pity, just a deep calm, the calm of one observing the inevitable end of a long story. They stared at each other for a moment that seemed eternal. In his eyes she saw not the predator but the prey, cornered and terrified. "Elizabeth," he began, voice hoarse, weak. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. I lost everything." He expected tears, recriminations, a shout of, "I told you so." But he found only her silence, a silence more powerful than any word. "I need help," he continued, voice breaking, tears finally streaming down his gaunt face. "I have nowhere to go. I have no one. I need you." The phrase, which once would have melted her, now sounded hollow, pathetic. He didn't need her. He needed a lifeboat, and she was the only one in sight. Then she spoke, her voice firm as steel, each word heavy with the memory of her own pain. "You need me?" she repeated, a faint trace of irony in her tone. "When I needed you, Richard, where were you? When I cried on the floor of this same house, without lights, without water, without a penny in my pocket, did you care? No. You were on yachts toasting to your freedom. Just as you left me with nothing, I can't help you. We reap what we sow." The words hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back, his face a mask of shock and despair. The door closed, leaving him outside in the darkness, alone with the ghosts of his choices. But the story wouldn't end there. The next day, Elizabeth's phone rang. It was Michael. His voice was a mix of anguish and plea. "Mom, I know what Dad did. I know he doesn't deserve anything. But he's destroyed. He's sleeping in the car. He's my dad. Please, Mom, don't be like he was. Don't stoop to his level. Show that you're better. Not for him, but for you. For me." Her son's appeal was the only weapon able to pierce Elizabeth's armor. She looked around, at the little house that had become her sanctuary, at the sunlight streaming through the window, at the life she'd built from ashes. Michael was right. Revenge would make her equal to Richard, would allow his cruelty to define her. Her victory wasn't in crushing him, but in rising above him, in being the person he never could be. Strong, but not cruel. Just, but not merciless. With her heart torn between the memory of pain and compassion for her son, she made a decision. She called Michael. "Son, I don't want to see your father again, ever, but I won't leave him in absolute misery. I'll give you every month the amount of minimum wage. You'll deliver it to him. It's a pension. Not a gift. It's enough for him to have a roof and not go hungry. That's my condition. He'll never know directly from me, and I never want to hear his name again." It was a perfect solution in its complexity, an act of mercy wrapped in a steel boundary. She would help him, but from an impassable distance, ensuring her peace without surrendering to vengeance. It was the full stop, her definitive declaration of independence. She wasn't just closing a chapter. She was writing the law of her own universe, one where strength and dignity reigned supreme. Elizabeth's decision to grant the pension through Michael wasn't an act of forgiveness, but of sovereignty. It was the way she found to close the door on the past without becoming a prisoner of resentment. With that last loose end tied, she felt free to finally inhabit the life she'd been building in secret. The months that followed were a silent and spectacular metamorphosis. While Richard learned to survive on minimum wage frugality in an anonymous town, tormented by the ghost of what he'd lost, Elizabeth prepared for her apotheosis. She didn't want to just be rich. She wanted her life to be a work of art, a testament to her resilience. Using part of her fortune, she acquired one of Charleston's most beautiful yet neglected colonial mansions, an 18th century property with an inner courtyard that seemed a whispered secret from history. For nearly a year, the mansion was shrouded in scaffolding, sparking a wave of curiosity in the city. People wondered what out-of-town millionaire had bought the architectural gem. No one could imagine that the poor thing from the blue little house, the abandoned woman living so modestly, was the mind and fortune behind the most meticulous restoration the city had ever seen. Elizabeth hired the best architects, historians, and craftsmen, insisting that every detail, from the heart pine floors to the ceiling frescoes, be returned to its original glory, but with touches of modernity and comfort reflecting her own soul, strong, classic, but undeniably contemporary. She wasn't just renovating a house, she was rebuilding herself in architectural form. The reveal happened on a spring evening, at a gala event to celebrate the mansion's reopening as a new cultural center and private residence. The invitation, sent to the city's most influential figures, the press and her family, bore only the name of the Kensington Foundation, a silent homage to Victoria. When guests arrived, they were greeted by a spectacle of elegance and taste. The mansion shone. Classical music floated through the air, and the inner courtyard lit by amber lights was a paradise. Everyone wondered who the mysterious hostess was. And then, at the top of the grand staircase, she appeared. Elizabeth. Not the woman bowed by pain, but a vision. She wore a simple, elegant dress in a deep blue reminiscent of night, and as her only jewel, a stunning diamond necklace that had belonged to Victoria Kensington. Her hair was in a sophisticated updo, and her smile was serene, the smile of a queen in her own castle. The silence that fell over the hall was more eloquent than any applause. People looked from her to Michael, who stood beside her with pride barely contained, and the puzzle pieces began fitting in everyone's minds. The woman who had been humiliated, discarded, and left with nothing had returned not as a survivor, but as a force of nature. The turnaround was so complete, so cinematic it seemed fiction. The story spread through Charleston like wildfire, the secret inheritance, the intelligence to invest, the discretion to wait for the right moment. Elizabeth was no longer the poor thing. She became the Lady of Charleston, a symbol of strength, dignity, and the infinite capacity to restart. She didn't need to tell her story. The house told it for her. Every detail was a declaration of her victory. Richard, meanwhile, heard the news from afar. Through a newspaper clipping someone showed him. The photo of Elizabeth, radiant and powerful, was his final sentence. Not a prison sentence, but one of irrelevance. He realized, with a clarity the booze could no longer blur, the true extent of what he'd lost. Not the money, but the woman, the partner, the friend, the architect of his life, whom he'd demolished out of pure greed. He continued his modest life, a ghost haunted not by poverty but by regret, a specter of a man who traded a real treasure for a handful of fake coins. Elizabeth, in her new life, found a peace that money couldn't buy, but that her independence allowed her to cultivate. She ran the foundation, promoted local artists, traveled the world, not to flaunt, but to learn. And on her tranquil evenings, seated on her mansion's veranda, looking at Charleston's lights, she knew her victory wasn't over Richard. It was over fear, over hopelessness. She won the moment she decided to clean the floor of a ruined little house, the moment she chose dignity over vengeance. She honored Victoria Kensington's legacy in the most complete way possible. She used the keys not just to open the doors of wealth, but to free her own soul. And in doing so, she became living proof that no one, absolutely no one, can destroy a woman with the courage to rebuild herself, brick by brick. Now, if you enjoyed this story, go ahead and click on that next video popping up on your screen, because in it, there's a tale of betrayal and turnaround like you've never seen before. Give it a like and see you in the next video.